It's really my honor to introduce the moderator of the panel and the person who has worked to put this together. That's Jamie Dos Santos. Jamie is the president and CEO of Terremark Public Sector. Terremark is now a Verizon company, and Verizon certainly gained in getting both Terremark and Jamie. She's a known expert in the cloud field, has been sitting on the AFCEA Cyber Committee as well as the Intelligence Committee for several years now, and recently was the chief author behind the Cyber Committee's first white paper, which is Securing the Cloud, and you can find that via the AFCEA website. I would encourage you to check it out. And one last thing that I'll say about Jamie, so then she can come forward and introduce her panel members, because I thought this was just a great thing. There's an organization called Cloud Now, and this is a nonprofit executive consortium of the leading women in cloud computing. They recently announced the winners of their inaugural Cloud Now Awards, and Jamie was one of 2 women to be so highly honored. And so we're all proud of you, and we're especially proud to have you at the podium along with your group of distinguished panelists. So.
Well, good morning, everybody. How are you? And Becky, that was so kind. Thank you so much. First of all, I'm grateful to see you guys. I think we're the entire population that did not go to RSA this week. So it's really good that we've got this many folks here, and obviously that the panel is here today too. So thank you for being here. A special thanks for my folks on the panel. What I'd like to do before I introduce them is just kind of create a little bit of a baseline of what we're going to talk about this morning. And so just back into reference what Becky was mentioning about the white paper, there were really 4 findings in the white paper. And although I certainly was involved, there were other authors and many people that helped donate findings to the white paper. Jill Singer from NRO was one. We met with the White House, Howard Schmidt, a lot of folks from DHS helped us. We certainly referenced back to FedRAMP when we were looking for findings. So 4 things very quickly. The first thing is when you're in a cloud environment, the visibility increases dramatically in that environment. So we found that there absolutely was the opportunity to do security better in a cloud environment than in a traditional IT environment. The second thing was that your workforce changes. And so who we kind of visualize and have in our IT organizations, those folks really had to move more into an IA and an IS capability because of the visibility that they were getting from the cloud environment. You now are getting metrics on, what's your server utilization, what's your storage utilization. You have the ability to dynamically change your portals and your firewalls. So workforce was second. The third was because of data coming into a big environment like that, a big infrastructure, you really had the ability to parse the data differently. You could do analytics on data, and then security, different levels of security could be added to that environment as well. And then lastly, there were really these ecosystems that were created, and I'll name some of the big boys on, I know I'm going to miss some, so please forgive me, but some of the ecosystems that were created, I will tell you, were driven because of financial, but the cloud market became enormous. And so you had ecosystems being formed by VMware, EMC, Cisco, HP. You really had, for maybe not the first time, certainly at this scale though, these big vendors working together, looking at security and solving some of the security problems in that infrastructure because there were so many dollars at stake. So based on those findings and that white paper, what we wanted to do was go out and try and find, which we did do, find experts that are writing about the cloud, certainly Sean's capabilities and expertise, and Matt's capabilities and expertise around FedRAMP and some of the security that's happening inside DHS. And then we went out and got a company, so Blackridge is here also. I'm going to individually introduce them now, but Blackridge is really a company that has created some security capabilities for cloud technology. So we'll get started with the panel. I'm going to try and run it a little bit like Pete did. I hope you guys were here for the panel earlier. It was just absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to introduce our guests, and then I'm going to come back to Sean and ask each one of them to please spend, a few minutes and say, okay, this is where, this is what got me to where I'm at for the last 6 months, and then what they think is going to be happening in the next year or so dealing with cloud in their offices. So Sean is going first. He is, his agency, Department of Homeland Security, is our host for today. He program manages network and infrastructure security for Department of Homeland Security. So everything that I just talked about is touching him. The second thing that he is responsible for, which everybody in this room knows about and has touched in one way or the other, is the Trusted Internet Connection Initiative, which we all know as TIC. So I was even asking him, when do you sleep with 2 initiatives that are that big? And then also, as I read more about him, he also champions common network security solutions for the federal government. So Sean, we certainly appreciate you taking your time out today and being with us. Go ahead.
Oh,
please.
You want me to speak now? Or?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. With all that scope, one of the important things I just want to bring up at the beginning is federal network security at DHS is not actually part of the DHS CIO's office, so we don't actually procure IT for DHS. Instead, we work with all the civilian federal agencies on their network and security architectures. So my job is to work with everyone from the smallest micro agency up to the largest civilian agencies. And we've been working on cloud and interoperability with TIC and looking at how we can do those things. As you mentioned, definitely cloud gives you a lot more potential visibility into your operations. We're also looking at how we can leverage that, gain the transparency with some of the other initiatives we're working on, continuous monitoring and continuous authorization through FISMA. I just wanted to mention a couple of the challenges we're having. Some of the big challenges are as we move federal information into the cloud, historically, application people didn't actually worry that much about security. They worried about it a little, but we tended to kind of assume that everyone who could reach the machines were somewhat trusted because they were inside the agencies. Now that we're moving to the cloud, that transparency, you say everyone needs to know IA and IS. Unfortunately, everyone doesn't know IA and IS, and expecting application developers to be information security experts for every single application, challenging, not realistic, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree.
So how can we take some of those implicit security arrangements we had before when we just put stuff in a data center and the only people who could get to it were semi-trusted folks, or within the agency where you had to be within the agency to reach it. Now that it's in the cloud, the applications actually have to think more about security, even though they do have more power to do that. The other thing that we're struggling with, and one of the things that we're trying to avoid, is prescribing how cloud providers do things. My job is to do reference architectures. I tend to be an engineer in my thought processes, but we do need to stand back and say, this is what we need to protect. We're looking towards industry to help us protect that and tell us the best ways to do that. We've had meetings with a few cloud providers. We definitely like to have more meetings with more cloud providers, not so much for us to tell them how to do it, but for them to tell us what's possible. So that's how I get started.
Thank you. Our second panelist Matt Goodrich in the middle here. So, in fact, if you all were here earlier, some of our panelists that were up in the previous discussion were talking about Matt, and I was thinking, I wonder if his ears are ringing, because they were actually referencing FedRAMP for almost everything that they do inside their agency. So Matt is one of these really smart guys that came to GSA with a Presidential Management Fellowship. I actually had to ask him how he got that. It was pretty amazing. So he's super smart, and he's from Miami, so he went to school in Miami. So when he came over to GSA, one of the first things that he did is he worked on several of the federal procurements for cloud. When he had finished with that, he actually started the development of FedRAMP. He left the office and went over to OMB for about 6 months and actually helped OMB with policy for procuring cloud. Came back, wrote a white paper on trying to advise some of the guys that were here in the earlier panel on actually how to go out and procure cloud. And right now, he is getting ready for a very large launch of FedRAMP, who we all, have been reading, which is supposed to come out in this year, June. So, Matt, want to give us? Yeah.
Thanks for that introduction. So I work at GSA under the Office of Citizen Services and Innovative Technologies under Dave McClure, if you know who that is. We basically, we're one of the few areas of GSA that's not under technically acquisition or buildings. So in one of the few areas it's appropriated. And my initiative that I'm on, the Federal Cloud Computing Initiative, we are one of the e-government projects we receive oversight from OMB into direction and things that we need to develop. I started that about 2.5 years ago on this initiative, and our initiative's real goal is to remove impediments to cloud adoption for federal agencies. One of those key ones that everyone has always said from the beginning is security, which is what we're up here to talk about today. And that's where FedRAMP started. Probably 2 years ago when we first started this discussion, as we were doing some of these procurements, and we were trying to figure out how are we going to secure these? Who's going to grant the authorization? What is it going to look like? And it started out pretty organically and pretty simply with just that simple question. And we initially wanted to have more than one agency authorize some of these procurements, which then slowly morphed into what FedRAMP is today. And so with that process, we realized that with cloud computing and with what we were being presented with, we really had a chance to change the way we do security in the government, particularly with cloud. Because when you look at cloud, you're talking about one boundary. You're talking about one service that each customer is using that same service. So it was a really unique way to actually approach security and how that's going to work. So with that, we started that process and went down what we thought would be the hard part was the technical portion of coming up with the security controls and what we would implement on those cloud solutions, and that was actually the really easy part. And then the policy questions started coming up, and that's what we've been working through over the past probably year. We released our initial documentation in November of 2010, and then the policy memo instantiating FedRAMP came out in December of 2011. So from that policy memo, we have 6 months to launch, which gives us till June 5th of this year. So right now we're in this pre-launch activity phase that we're talking about. We've recently released, in January, released the security controls that everyone can look at. We've also released our concept of operations earlier this month, and then yesterday we released the Joint Authorization Board Charter. So it's a really exciting program, really jazzed about it over at GSA, and it's not just a GSA program though, it's a joint effort between OMB, GSA, where we're housing the PMO, but it's also a joint project between GSA, DoD, and DHS, as well as we're partnering very heavily with NIST to make sure that everything that we do aligns with federal policy and FISMA compliance and things like that. So that's a brief description of what FedRAMP is, then talk more about it as questions come up.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Matt. So our last panelist, Tim Keller, so I was telling him when we were back in the speaker's room, I was like, I was so excited when I read yours because I think he actually he's probably a couple of years older than me. He started AT&T in 1979, so that was definitely before divestiture because I started in 1981. I was like, wow, you just don't find these guys anymore, but we are still around. So he had a very respectable career with very large companies, obviously AT&T, then through Unisys and some others. And I'm interested to hear why he made the shift, actually as I did as my career went on, to a more nimble company. You're actually vice president now at Blackridge Technologies. And so I did a little bit of research on Blackridge, and it appears that this company has invented a breakthrough that solves the vulnerability inside TCP/IP, which, you know, absolutely is going to affect us in the cloud. So I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit about some of the security capability, but there's a term called cloaking that I'm anxious to hear about, and I think that's part of the new technology, right, Tim?
Thank you, Jamie. One correction to what Jamie said. I didn't start AT&T. I joined AT&T. I wish I started it. And I can certainly say, yes, I'm back into a smaller company, and more importantly for me, after many years in the service industry, back to a technology company. I'd argue, my roots in technology started with AT&T Bell Labs. Everybody, I'm sure, has heard of Bell Labs. It was a phenomenal place to work. I absolutely loved it. And I'd probably say the work I'm doing right now in Blackridge is on par with what we did at Bell Labs kind of stuff. So regarding today's topic, the last panel talked a lot about cloud. We're talking about cloud up here. I could pose the question of, is there really anything new about cloud or not? Is there anything really new under the sun regarding cloud? One could argue that that the answer to that question is no. That a cloud is really nothing more than a data center. Data centers have been around for 30 years. Many clouds use virtualization. Virtualization is in fact new, and it's pretty dynamic and does introduce additional security concerns. But arguably, virtualization is not specific to a cloud. And then the last piece I think about security when I think about clouds is the fact that the third component of it is cybersecurity. And whether you're in a cloud or not in a cloud, we're all very aware of the concerns with cybersecurity. So those are the three areas, and the question is, well, there are definitely unique challenges associated with the cloud, not just because it's a cloud, but I'd argue because of virtualization and because of the shared environment, and that is different than if you have a private data center. So if you look at the security technologies that are in play today that are protecting clouds in general, it's interesting that it's pretty much the same technology we've been using for the last 10, 15, 20 years. Firewalls, intrusion detection, VPNs, that's what we're using to secure cloud environments. That's the same things we use to protect standalone data centers. The question is that sufficient for this new environment? And is there anything new on the horizon? And I'll come back later on this panel. I'm certainly going to talk about what Blackridge is doing, but I want to talk about some of the other evolution in some of those products, firewalls probably in particular, and what is happening with the technology there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tim. So I have, we actually had all met and said, okay, what are some of the best questions that we want to get answers, out to you all? So I have a list of questions here, and I have questions here, and thankfully the font is big enough that I can see them. So I have some come from both sides. I think I'm just going to start with some of the ones that we thought would be really important for you guys to hear first. So these guys are kind of familiar with some of these questions since we've already talked about them, but I'm going to start with Sean again. And the first question that really kind of goes to the heart of all of this, and because he actually is managing all the network and infrastructure security for Department of Homeland Security, I mean, if you guys think about that, that's just so enormous. I really would like to hear his take on this question. And so the question is, do you feel there's a better chance, if done correctly, to secure your cloud infrastructure compared to a legacy IT infrastructure?
So let me start out by saying I don't actually do the DHS infrastructure. Keith Trippey and the fine folks at DHS won that to actually operate and keep that secure. But working with all the civilian agencies, as I said, from the smallest to the very largest, it's like woebegone days. Basically, on average, 50% of the agencies will probably have better security by using the cloud. The other 50% of the agencies are probably doing better now than they may be able to do in the cloud. So the question is what overall from the perspective of the federal government works best for everyone. Do we move all federal information to the cloud? Do we take low-value information, move that to the cloud, and the high-value information we don't? There's still a lot of trade-offs and back and forth that individual agencies are going to have to make. However, just the cloud technology, whether they do it as a service provider or whether they do that in-house, as you mentioned, definitely has benefits, security benefits. Be able to automate basically everything in the cloud is a great improvement over manual processes. Allows better tracking, better auditing, better visibility into what your assets are. Most agencies still today, although FSMA has been asking it for years, still do not know how many systems they have. Whereas with a cloud service provider, you get a bill every month that tells you how many systems you have. So it makes it very easy. So there's definitely the trade-offs. I definitely think cloud is going to improve security for a lot of agencies. However, I don't view it as a panacea. There are definitely going to be some mission-specific things where we do the risk assessment and we decide, well, for that, maybe not the cloud.
Amazing. Thank you. And Matt or Tim, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add in, I think if you look at, I forget which report it is, I think it's in the cloud strategy from OMB. I mean, you look at the amount of IT that OMB estimates can move to the cloud, it's only a fourth of it. So I think it really relates to the cloud might have better security than a lot of what agencies are doing it, but for that data that's appropriate to move to the cloud, right? So there's a lot of systems that aren't appropriate to move to the cloud because it might be less secure if they move what they have currently. So it's really looking at that type of data and technology that you're using and what's appropriate to move to a cloud environment that's important to really look at.
Yep, I agree, actually. Tim, anything?
I agree with Matt. I
Yep.
think you got to look at it. Yep.
So the next question that we want to, Matt, this is going to go directly at you, and it's obviously pointed at FedRAMP because of you being so behind it and basically authoring a lot of it. And the question is, it's a little bit tough, and it says, is FedRAMP, being compliant with FedRAMP and with our published standards enough for solid best practices, or simply should be used as a baseline? And is that baseline more towards a risk baseline or a security baseline? So there's two parts. Okay.
So I'm assuming you're talking about your paper and those best practices. I think the paper really complements what FedRAMP is doing in the sense that FedRAMP's really kind of and FSMA and the NIST 800 series and all that is really the technical way to do security, how you're actually going to implement it. But this is really, the complement of how you're going to do it and how you're going to instantiate that as an actual thought process behind why you're doing the security, right? So they kind of go together. I don't think that they're not, I wouldn't say that by looking at this, if you say you're doing all of that you're going to have enough security because you have to have that technical portion to it. But this definitely describes the theory of everything that we're trying to do within FedRAMP. And so whether you're talking about the risk or compliance, one thing we're really trying to do with FedRAMP is, if you look at the concept of operations that we published, there is, with FSMA, there's always going to be a compliance element to it, right? I mean, FSMA is a compliance, it's a compliance mandate. And so with that, though, we're trying to move from that authorization being a snapshot in time to moving that towards real risk management. And so the NIST 800-137 and continuous monitoring is we're really trying to focus from moving that initial authorization into something that really provides more real-time data as you're actually using a system. And so looking at that system on a regular and recurring basis. So we're trying to focus on those security controls that we're going to be implementing or that cloud service providers must implement on their system, and figuring out a way to automate more of those controls. Cyberscope started that with the 3 controls that they use now, with the CCE, CVE, and CPEs, but then moving and including more controls behind that so that we can really look at the real-time visibility and the real risk posture of a system. So it's really trying to move from that compliance to a real risk-based way to do it. And cloud's the perfect way to do that because most cloud providers, they have to bill with this technology, right? That's the way they're actually provisioning these services.
They can build against it as a baseline.
Right. And so they already have the technology based on the way they provide their services. And so it's actually a lot easier for them to implement these new technologies and new ways to actually look at the security posture on a more real-time basis.
Yeah.
So we're trying to leverage that heavily within FedRAMP.
Thank you. And I have one more question for you, and then actually, Sean, if you would weigh in, and then I've got a couple for Tim kind of lined up on both things here. The next one for Matt is, I think we all realized, and I was actually hoping this question would come up with a panel that was here before, because these guys are actually operating very large agencies and trying to move into this environment. Initially, I think that cloud became so popular and was adopted so quickly because for our life, for government life, it was adopted very quickly, I think. It was, obviously driven by budget. I mean, it was obviously driven by, budgets cuts and constraints. So my question is, have we been doing it long enough to A, substantiate and really come back and say, yeah, we saved the money we thought we were going to save, because one of the second points in the paper was that it does change your workforce. I mean, you've talked about that too, and I know Sean's talked about that. So is the budget, really being saved? That's the first piece. And then the second piece is, out of all these other benefits that we think we derive out of the cloud and we're citing, has it become a strategic move now? Have we kind of said, okay, yeah, it was a good budget reason, but now has it become more of a strategic reason for agencies to move over?
So the first part, I mean, the saving money and things like that, I think Stephen Van Roekel, the federal CIO, speaks a lot about the productivity gap between government and industry. And I think that there are a lot of cost savings that are realized with the cloud. But I also think a lot of that isn't necessarily directly related to the IT expenditure. It's related to other things that the agency's doing, the productivity that you're gaining by moving to these systems. There are a lot of examples. In my agency, GSA, we're saving, I think I'm not going to give the exact number, it's millions of dollars a year by moving to Google Mail from our previously in-house system. But there's also a lot of things that agencies are gathering, more productivity and better collaboration and things like that allow them to do their job and do more at their job within the same amount of time, which saves money too. So I think cost is the initial first driver, but I think agencies are gaining a lot more from the cloud than just saving money. And I think that everyone is probably aware of that as well. And in terms of that changing the workforce and is it more strategic, I think that's one thing that Vivek's vision of this cloud-first policy and making the 25-point plan and making agencies identify those 3 cloud projects that they must move within 18 months by June of this year was really trying to make it more strategic and make agencies realize that the cloud, they can move to the cloud and they don't need to wait, make the government move fast. And one of that, when I was on my stint at OMB, the paper that I wrote that was published last week through the CIO and CAO Council was really a best studies and best practices of what agencies have been doing when they move to the cloud and what they need to be doing better. So there's the top 10 areas that agencies should focus when they're contracting on things that they need to focus on between security, which we're talking about now, and FOIA and discovery, and SLAs in terms of service and things like that. So I think that we've really moved from that 25-point plan, pushing agencies faster and faster to the cloud, and then providing the cloud strategy, and then FedRAMP, the memo instantiating that, and then also this, which is kind of that next strategic guidance of how to make sure you're doing it properly. So I think it really has, I think the administration's done a really good job at, pushing people faster to do it because cloud's there. It is a budgetary reality that you are being required to do more with less. And so the administration's trying to push agencies to realize they can, and giving them that guidance, the push, then the strategy, and then now the practical guidance to do it as well.
Yeah. No, it's fantastic. Thank you. And Sean, do you mind commenting both on the budgetary piece as maybe the primary driver, and then on the strategic piece, are you seeing that really the adoption has been because it's becoming more strategic?
Sure. So the budget piece is kind of the headline, but in practice, I think a lot of agencies are not hanging their hats so much on the budget piece anymore. The productivity, being able to do more with less, even in declining budgets, is where people are going. The strategic part is more interesting because what agencies are finding is they're able to do things they couldn't do with their in-house systems, especially in the strategic initiatives around telework and moving things more to the front lines. Citizen services are much easier to do in a distributed cloud environment. So it allows the agencies to make strategic decisions, to lean much further forward to provide those services than they could do with a few data centers around Washington, D.C. So we're definitely seeing agencies leverage that part of it. But once again, the budget is, of course, always the top headline that drives everything. So just because it's more productive, if it's twice as expensive, they aren't going to do it. But if it's more productive and it's about the same cost, then it's definitely something that makes agencies interested.
Yeah, no, thank you. So Tim, I've got a couple backed up here for you. The first one, this actually came in from the audience. It says, how do you deal with network devices sharing and private cloud? And the comment basically is, we don't want to have to encrypt all back-end communications traffic.
So I don't think I can answer that without describing a little bit of what we're doing here. So before I get into some of the new things that Blackridge has put together, let me go back to the firewall discussion, because I said, obviously, we're still using the same technologies to protect the clouds today for the most part. And I'm not saying in any way that that's wrong, but some of the things that make a cloud environment unique, some of the additional challenges, again, I'll go back to the fact that it's a virtual, in many cases, a virtual environment. You've got a dynamically changing landscape, basically, within the data center. And the way firewalls work historically is they're very address-oriented. So firewalls will block based on source IP address, destination IP address, ports, VLAN segments, things that are very, very much physically oriented, address-oriented. So when you take a firewall and you're trying to protect a virtual environment, one of the challenges we have is if that environment's being reconfigured by a VMware kind of a solution, how do you know that the firewall is keeping pace with that? So, and I think we could all argue that generally they haven't historically. The good news is, from what I'm seeing, I see the firewall vendors actually trying to deal with that problem, all of them. And effectively, I think what they're trying to do is get to the point where they are fully integrated with the hypervisor, so when you reconfigure the network, the firewall automatically follows suit. And there is some of that today, but I don't think where we need to be. So now I'll talk a little bit about what another approach to solving the problem. But before I do that, let me talk a little bit about it. I think everybody in this room understands probably that effective cyber attacks against large enterprises like federal government or any agency in that government, as opposed to kids hacking for the fun of it or whatever, that real attacks aimed at real large enterprises with real important information start with significant reconnaissance. That reconnaissance could go on for a week, it could go on for 2 years before somebody decides they're going to actually formulate an attack. And it's through this reconnaissance that's gone over a period of time that a true, very specific attack can be formulated to go after whatever they're going after. So I want to talk a little bit about it. Basically, if you can stop the reconnaissance, one could argue that you're going to very much limit somebody's ability to pull off a successful attack. But to do that, let me talk about something that actually goes back to my prior life, and I think something that everybody in this room would understand. I want to talk about life before caller ID at your home. So life before caller ID, and I was there, the way you would have to deal with your telephone at home is the phone would ring. You really didn't have any choice but to pick it up to find out who was on the other end, right? No caller ID. It could be an important call. You pretty much had to pick that phone up. Once you pick the phone up, whoever's on the other end starts to do reconnaissance on you immediately. One, they know you're home. Two, maybe they hear your kids in the background. Maybe they hear your wife or husband in the background. Whatever's going on, they're doing reconnaissance on you. There's nothing you can do to stop it because you picked the phone up. All right. So the way we then introduce caller ID, now we have a choice. So I hear the phone ring, I look at the caller ID, I make a determination that I don't know who you are, I'm not interested in talking to you because I don't know who you are. And most importantly, I certainly don't want to pick you up if you're a stranger and have you start to do reconnaissance on my home. All right, so that's what we did with caller ID. Now, how do you convert that into what we're talking about here, or the networking environment? Well, the way networking works, basically, to try to parallel with the telephone example, is fundamentally working with TCP/IP. So TCP/IP is the underlying protocol that allows two computers to talk to each other. TCP/IP is a wonderful protocol. It's been around for 30 years. It is the basis on a global basis of how we make the internet work, basically. It's a wonderful protocol because it does what it's supposed to do. It doesn't ask questions. If you ask for a session with a server over TCP/IP, you ask for a TCP/IP session, that protocol will establish it. And it does that with a 3-packet handshake. So it doesn't do it instantaneously. It starts with the first packet for a request, called a SYN packet. That server will respond back with a SYN acknowledgement, and then there's an acknowledgement of that acknowledgement. After those 3-packet handshake, you now have that session established. And again, TCP does it. In other words, what it doesn't do is ask a question, should I? Should I establish this session with who you are? Maybe you're an attacker. I don't know who you are, but in today's paradigm, it will. If I go back to the reconnaissance discussion, once you establish a TCP/IP session, people can start to do reconnaissance on your network. Significant, right? Once that session is established, you can run scans against the network. By the way, this is all at layer 2 of the stack. Firewalls, VPNs, intrusion detection systems all operate at layer 3 and above, which means all of this is happening before any of those traditional security devices are engaged. Once the session is up, you answering your phone at home, reconnaissance can begin. And you could probably be amazed at the amount of information that I can pull out of your network, everything about what your network looks like, what release levels you're on, what patches you have, what ports are open and available, what applications are running. I can do all of that before your firewalls ever engage, just because I've got a TCP/IP session set up. Now, the world has known that this has been a problem for 30 years, since the inception of TCP/IP. And the reason why nobody's ever dealt with the problem is because you can't, right? To touch TCP/IP, which is the underlying protocol for the world, you would effectively probably break it. So people have shied away from solving the problem because the notion was you can't touch TCP/IP. So what this new technology can actually do is it breaks that paradigm. All right, so let's go back to the telephone. What I really want to know is, before I establish a TCP/IP session with you, I want to know who you are at layer 2. Before I even set up the session, forget about applications and firewalls downstream. Before I'll even give you a connection, I want to know who you are. And that's effectively what we now have in this technology, is the ability to say, when you request that session, on that very first SYN packet that comes in, I want to know who you are. And the technology that has been developed actually allows that to happen. So now, much like caller ID, if I don't know who you are, if you're not a known quantity, a true known identity to me, and I'm not talking about protecting your website. Websites have to be open to anonymous people, right? That's why they're out there. I'm talking about critical infrastructure, enterprise, applications, anything that is critical needs to be protected. Almost by definition, there is a known user group who should have access to that, and everybody else shouldn't. So if I can determine on that first session setup request of TCP that I don't know who you are, then what I'll do is not respond to you. I will not send you a SYN ACK back. So if I won't even respond back to you, what has effectively happened? You are cloaked off the network. You can't even see me. You can't get me to respond. I don't exist as far as you're concerned for anybody except a known identity that we have authorized to have access to that. Now, if you think about how to apply that in the cloud, obviously one of the concerns with the cloud is we're intermixing data. And it's moving around on me because of the virtual environment. How do I know people don't have access to my data? Well, if you think about what this new technology does, I've abstracted away the notion of address at all. I didn't talk about address at all. What I look for is an identity. If I know who you are, and you are supposed to have access to that resource you're asking for, I frankly don't care where it is. I'm not protecting it anymore based on the address it's at or the physical VLAN that it's on, which is the way firewalls work. I'm saying I'm going to protect it based on your identity. If you're not a person who should have access to it, I'm not going to block you at the firewall. I'm not going to give you a TCP/IP session. And the difference between those two is I could block you at the firewall probably, but you've got a TCP/IP session up. Once you've got that, you've got reconnaissance on me. So we're backing up the security. We're doing two things. Stop it before you even get the connection. And second of all, don't do that based on addressing, do that based on identity. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what we're doing.
And so now we know what cloaking is.
That's what
That's cloaking.
Yes.
Thank you. I have this next question. Actually, I have a question here. I think I'll move to this one since it came from the audience. And Sean, I'm going to ask you this, and then Tim, this is probably appropriate for you to weigh in on also. There's a perception that agencies with high security requirements will face higher costs to get the same level of security in the cloud. What is your opinion on this?
Agencies with high security requirements already face high costs. So are they going to have higher costs, not necessarily high costs, by moving to the cloud, if they move to the cloud at all? As Matt said, the initial swag was about 25% of the federal information could be moved to the cloud. And some of that high cost, high value information is probably not in that 25%. But those agencies that do have very high requirements are paying high costs. There are things that perhaps public clouds may not be appropriate, but the general cloud services definitely do give you some economies that could be applicable even in those high security environments. We've already heard at other conferences, I tend to deal only with the unclassified cloud, but the other conferences, some folks who deal with the classified clouds are definitely talking about doing classified clouds.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something there. They're going to have high costs either way.
Yeah, that's true. The folks that were on the panel prior to you guys were actually talking about, private, secure clouds. And certainly most of the agencies, Department of Energy, certainly on the DoD side and DHS side, they have data that is unclassified and classified. So certainly if you could baseline what you're going to be using as a system on the on class side and unclass side, certainly would be great for them, if they could have a consistent way of dealing with their data. So they did talk a little bit about that on the panel before. So, Tim, do you think there's enough security capabilities or technologies out there to allow us to do that?
To reduce cost?
For high security cloud environments?
Not sure if there's too much security products out there or not enough right now, but I think as the security technologies evolve, and again, I'll talk a little bit about the new technology that we have, certainly it was not an intended direct outcome of what we tried to solve. We tried to solve a security problem, basically. But if you look at a typical enterprise and how much traffic is being presented to that enterprise and therefore being presented to your downstream assets, your firewalls, intrusion detection systems, your applications, your servers, and maybe most importantly, the security devices, because hopefully they're stripping a lot of bad traffic out of that. But the truth is, and we're trying to get better numbers on this, but what we can see is anywhere from 50 to 90% of traffic that comes at an enterprise, and I would argue maybe the federal government, the high-profile federal agencies, maybe even higher than that because of the attack vectors from all over the world. But right now, today's environment, your firewalls, your security devices have to deal with every one of those incoming requests, whether it's somebody who you know who they are or whether you could care about them at all. And again, if 50 to 90% of the traffic presented is unauthorized, unwanted traffic, you've got 10 to 50% of your traffic, good traffic, is somewhat overwhelmed by all of this traffic that's coming in that your systems have to deal with.
Right.
And again, your security systems, firewalls in particular. So if you think about what I just described, and the answer is, I won't set a session up with you unless you are somebody that I want to talk to, what I've done is removed all of that traffic load from your downstream infrastructure. And yes, I believe it could have a huge impact on at least the security devices. Your applications are probably still going to be there, but the amount of security devices that you need and the complexity of keeping them configured and up to date can be dramatically reduced because I'm going to strip a huge amount of that traffic off.
From even going, right. Yep, exactly. Thank you. Matt, I'm going to, this question is directly to you, and I'm going to add a little bit to it. So do you think when you're writing FedRAMP and now you've got this launch in June, two pieces of that. Number one, do you think we have a good enough posture right now with the security capabilities that we do, with some of the infrastructure providers to satisfy what you're looking for? And then number two, how do you keep up with new technologies that are going to come out? I will tell you that, we're doing a huge investment in memory forensics, so you actually get into the infrastructure and are watching the state of the infrastructure versus being out on the network side. So as these capabilities come out and they get commercialized, how will you keep up with that from a FedRAMP standpoint?
The first part about do we have enough security now, I absolutely think we do. I think that the government, I think there's been varying degrees to which the government has implemented that with cloud service providers, which is one of the main drivers behind FedRAMP.
It's not good if you don't use it.
Right. I mean, I definitely think it's there. I mean, I think cloud providers can provide this level of security. I think a lot of what we're trying to do with FedRAMP is be very transparent about what's required when contracting with the government. Most cloud service providers, if they've never done business with the government, has no idea what the certification process is through FSMA. You go to the NIST 800 series and they're amazing. They give you a lot of information, but it's very overwhelming. You have no idea. You look at 837, then you have to go to 53, then you go to 53A, and then it's confusing. But what we're trying to do with FedRAMP is really simplify that process and make it known when you come into contracting with the government. So the entire process is very clear. All the documentation that you're going to be doing is very clear. We're providing guidance and templates and everything like that for not only agencies but cloud service providers. So the security, I think, is there. I think it's a better understanding of what that actually entails when you're actually doing that security. Yep. And so that's just one of the things that I think we're really, really hyping with FedRAMP is really changing that kind of customer relationship management between not only FedRAMP and the agencies that we're going to be servicing, but also the government and cloud service providers to make sure that everyone's on the same page and knows exactly what everyone's expecting of each other. And then keeping up with the new technologies, the thing that we're trying to do with FedRAMP along the lines of transparency is really lay out a clear roadmap of where we're going. So when I was talking about that automation is really talking about where we're going to be going. So we expect to have this percentage automated at launch, and then in 6 months we're going to expect this, another 6 months we're expecting this, et cetera, moving along that path. But also one thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to be very agnostic in terms of how you provide that solution. So we're not saying you have to do it in this certain way. We're saying you have to provide this capability. Right. So therefore, we're not really, any new technology that comes and does this, great, bring that on. If it's easier, more cost effective, does a better job, do that. But we're trying to make sure that we focus on the requirements of what we need, but not saying how to do it. And so that vendors and and industry can really figure out the most innovative way to meet the needs without us saying how you have to meet that need.
Right. No, I appreciate it. So just, I need to follow up on that a little bit. So for example, if you're an agency and you're using the FedRAMP process to get your ATO and now you're operational, and FedRAMP comes out with a new updated, are you guys anticipating having to go back through the ATO or?
I mean, it depends. I mean, the new requirements, I mean, a perfect example would be revision 4 of the 853. So the new security controls that NIST is putting out will probably be finalized sometime in the summer. So they have a change control process for that. We're going to be following basically the same sort of change control process that if we have any new requirements, we'll be very clear when you have to meet those requirements, and it'll follow basically that same sort of thing that NIST does or other agencies with that to make sure that it's not a just one fell swoop, well, now you're no longer compliant. But we are really moving towards this idea of continual authorization instead of when DHS gave out the guidance on A130, the OMB memorandum, or A130, said that you have to reauthorize every 3 years for a government system. Well, the new DHS guidance on VISMA says that as long as you have an effective continuous monitoring program, then you don't have to, that covers that 3 years, because you're, in essence, continuously authorizing that system. So we're working with DHS, and particularly the NPPD division, which Sean is under, to make sure whatever we're doing within FedRAMP counts as that. So what the continuous monitoring activities that we're going to be requiring count as continual reauthorization, and so there isn't going to be this necessary new reauthorization every 3 years or within a certain amount of time frame. So
that's excellent. Thank you. And Sean, I have a question for you, and then I have some cloaking questions that came up for Tim, so we'll go back to that. Sean, the question for you is, with you, and we use the term, and this is what I read, being a champion, if you will, of common network security solutions. And so if you don't mind, spend a couple minutes on what you mean by champion, but also, as we're looking at FedRAMP and the security implications for FedRAMP and the stuff that Tim's talking about, are you hopeful that some of the things that the companies are coming up with, the new technologies, can apply not only to the network but down to the cloud infrastructure as well? Are you hoping, when you say, or when it's stated common network security solution, are you hoping for that end to end?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, basically, when that phrase, champion common solutions, the idea behind that is we're not smart enough to figure out everything. What we do is we go out to the agencies, find the best agencies that are doing things in different areas, take that and try to drive those best practices across all the other federal agencies. So it's not so much we come up with different things, but we take the folks who are doing the best jobs at it and come up with common solutions, or what we call common reference architectures, that any agency can then use in their own work. Obviously, each agency customizes it a little bit. And we've seen that in other things. And FedRAMP is kind of doing that same process with cloud. Basically, we're taking the GSA, DHS, DOD, and the individual agency who is doing the authorization to come up with a common solution that can then be used by any agency in the federal government. So that's definitely what we mean by championing those common solutions. Can we drive? We use the term network because my program came from the Trusted Internet Connections initiative, and that was very much a network-focused thing. At the time, there was a strong feeling from the federal agencies that they did not want us messing with their internal enterprise applications.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's why we use the term network. We've been around for 3 years. Our mandate has changed a little. OMB has assigned us some responsibilities under FISMA, so we are now getting into the applications, in particular at agencies, or if they do the applications on the cloud. So we're probably going to be looking at both those things, but it's still going to be very much the agencies are the expert in these areas. We find the best agencies that are doing the job in those applications and work with them to come up with solutions that can be used by other agencies. So we're not going to stop reinventing the wheel, but maybe we don't need to invent quite so many wheels.
I gotcha. No, I appreciate it. I will add just one thing from an infrastructure provider in cloud is that one of the lessons learned recently with attacks on the infrastructure is that they are coming in through the applications versus, traditional network or traditional, other means of attacks. So, okay, Tim, we have some cloaking questions. The first one is, how is the trusted ID established? That's the first part. And I have a second one saying, what monitoring, auditing capabilities does the cloaking capability provide?
I think I understand the first half, so let me start with that and maybe come back to the second one. So there's no single answer to how we create the identity. It's a very specific field that we're using in TCP/IP. That's how we've done it. And remember, I talked earlier that you can't break TCP because it's the foundation for how the internet works. But nobody said you couldn't touch it. So we actually hijack a field that's in the TCP/IP protocol that in a standard implementation is a random number. It's a sequence number. And the number in the TCP/IP protocol is not important. What's important is when you get a response back, that number's been incremented by 1. So what we've done is we hijack that field. So I put another number in
Isn't it the
that
first
field.
header of the IP? Isn't that where?
It's in the SYN packet.
Yeah.
Right. So that first packet that comes requesting a session. So if I replace that random number with another random number, and that new random number actually has a whole lot of meaning to me, it's actually your identity. The question is, how do we generate the identity? It's actually a hash of something that is unique to you. And I'm being a little bit imprecise here because that is the way it works. In other words, it almost doesn't matter what we use that is unique to you. It could be your Active Directory ID. High likelihood that's what it will be, because what we don't want to do is create another provisioning system for new identities in an enterprise. Basically, we can use whatever your enterprise uses for identity today, your Active Directory identity. It literally could be a JPEG file. It could be a picture of you, because that's going to be a unique file that would never be duplicated ever in the world again if it's your photo. And we use that to basically create a cryptographic key, which is the identity token that I've been referring to. So it's cryptographically secure. It's a hash value of a number of different inputs, so it'll end up being unique. And that's pretty much how we'll generate it. So it definitely is sound from a type 1 cryptology perspective in terms of being a secure token.
I got it. Okay, and I think the second part really is asking, is there any auditing capabilities?
Like any system that you put into your network, clearly you have to have a management platform for it. We log all events, so we know, and that's something that you can get out of this technology is, well, what traffic have you rejected? Where did it come from? So we'll track everything that we do, and fundamentally we'll do one of 3 things. We'll recognize the identity and let it pass. We won't recognize an identity and we'll either terminate it, not respond, cloaked basically, or it's a policy engine, which means maybe I don't just not respond. Maybe what I do is I redirect you to a honeypot. And maybe I start surveilling you back because I can do that.
Right. No, I appreciate it. So, listen, they're going to pull us off the stage here pretty quickly. I think we're down to about 5 minutes left. I have one important thing that I'd like to pose to all of you, if you don't mind. Just try and answer as you can. But, Matt, I'd like to start with you. Any key shortfalls? Anything blaring out at you, while you're trying to set standards for us and say, look, this is the one area we've really got to work on?
I mean, I think I talked about it earlier. I really think that security's there. I think that cloud service providers can do it. I think agencies can do it. We all know it. But it's really that customer relationship management between government and industry, and making sure that what government needs for security, that CSPs fully understand that as well. We're required by law to meet FISMA requirements, and if we want to use your service, you have to understand that these are things that we have to do, but also government needs to be clear about what we expect of you at the same time and what this process is going to entail. So not only that, I was talking about continuous monitoring, is not only clear with what that first authorization is going to look like, but on an ongoing basis, what we're going to be expecting of you. Yeah, so I think that's the biggest shortfall, is really just that everything's there. I think cloud service providers and government, everyone knows it's very clear what has to be done, but we need to be on the same page and really make it a partnership and building trust between the agencies and industry and the cloud service providers to make sure that we all know we're all on the same page about what's expected and what we need.
Yeah, it's a great point. Thank you. Sean, what do you think?
The biggest challenge, like most things, is people. Getting people to understand how to work in this cloud environment, technical management, et cetera. And also security. Security almost always comes down to a people issue. We tried to solve the people issue with technology, but fixing people is very hard.
Yeah.
We haven't figured out how to do that yet. But nevertheless, as we move to things to the cloud, it does make those things more apparent. When we had stuff inside the agency, inside the data center, as I said at the beginning, a lot of the stuff was just kind of implicit because the only people who could get to those systems were people inside the agency, and we assumed there was some reason for them. Now that we're putting these applications in the cloud, and if those applications don't have that same concept of people as before, that's where we're going to have trouble. And with cloud providers, I know a lot of discussion with cloud providers, they don't want to get into that business, but for federal agencies, that is our business.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's going to be a challenge of service level agreements, who's responsible for what.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm very grateful. Actually, I totally agree with your answer. And then Tim, just lastly, any new approaches that you're seeing out there from other companies similar to yours, or in dealing with some of the security challenges? You seeing anything new coming up
I think
that Matt and Sean are going to have to deal with?
I think it's, as I said, I think it's slow. We're still using many of the same technologies.
Yeah, foundation.
But there's evolution. Like I said, the firewall industry is evolving. There are actually firewalls that are now identity aware, where there are firewalls that will not allow you access without first querying for an identity. Again, the difference between that and what Blackridge is doing is that's still at the application layer, which means the connection is already established. But yeah, I think the technologies are evolving, and I think cloud's one of the big pushes, and the cloud's really just beginning to be adopted pretty heavily. So industry will follow.
Yes. No, thank you. So you guys have been fantastic. I hope it was valuable. Your questions were amazing. And I am so grateful for you guys coming out today. Thank you so much.